The morning after the best day of my life, my mother called me 62 times. 62 times. I know the exact number because I counted them later, sitting on the porch of our honeymoon cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, wrapped in a flannel blanket, drinking coffee while the sun came up over the ridge. I watched my phone light up over and over and over again, her name blazing across the screen in the early morning quiet, and I didn't answer a single one. Not one. Because the night before, while she was sitting in her living room in her expensive robe watching the late news, she had seen my husband on television, standing on the steps of the state capitol, shaking hands with the governor of Tennessee, laughing with 3 U.S. senators, surrounded by the kind of people my mother had spent her entire life trying to impress, at an event that had started as our wedding reception and turned into something none of us could have predicted. And I knew, watching those calls roll in, exactly what she wanted to say. I knew the panic in those 62 attempts. I knew the specific flavor of her regret. Because 3 days earlier, she had looked me in the eye and told me she would not attend my wedding, that she and my father were not going to waste a Saturday watching me play dress-up in a barn with a bunch of nobodies, that I was embarrassing the family, that I had always embarrassed the family, and that if I went through with it, I was on my own. I went through with it, and on my own, turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. My name is Savannah Mercer. Well, Savannah Coldwell now, and this is the story of the wedding my family refused to attend, the truth they didn't know, and the 5-second voicemail that ended my mother's reign over my life for good. I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, in a house where appearances were everything. Not happiness, not kindness, not love exactly, though I believe my parents would say they loved me in their way. Appearances. The car in the driveway, the neighborhood, the school, the clothes, the last name of whoever you were dating, the job title of whoever you eventually married. Everything was evaluated through the lens of how it looked to other people, specifically the particular category of other people my mother had decided were worth impressing. My mother, Diane Mercer, had grown up working class and clawed her way into what she considered respectability through sheer determination and strategic marriage. My father, Robert, came from a slightly better-off family, and their union had been, in my mother's mind, a step up the ladder she was always climbing. They were comfortable, upper middle class, members of the right country club, subscribers to the right opinions about the right things. And they had 2 daughters. My older sister, Courtney, who had done everything right, married a corporate attorney, lived in a house with a gate, sent her children to private school, and me. Me, who had gone to art school instead of business school. Me, who had spent my 20s working at nonprofits and community organizations instead of climbing a corporate ladder. Me, who had dated artists and teachers, and once, memorably, a man who made his living as a woodworker, a fact my mother brought up at dinner for approximately 4 years afterward, as evidence of my questionable judgment. And then I met Eli. Eli Caldwell. My person, the man I was going to marry in a barn on his family's property in Hardin Valley, surrounded by wildflowers and string lights and the people who had actually shown up for us over the years. My mother called it trashy. She was wrong about that, and about almost everything else. Let me tell you how it all went down. I met Eli Caldwell at a fundraising gala for a literacy nonprofit I'd been working with for about 2 years. I was there in my professional capacity, coordinating volunteers, managing the silent auction table, wearing the one nice dress I owned that still fit right. Eli was there because the nonprofit's board chair was an old friend of his family's and had invited him. He was quiet in a way I wasn't used to. Not shy, just deliberate. He had the kind of presence that didn't announce itself.
He came over to the auction table and spent about 20 minutes looking at every single item, actually reading the descriptions, asking thoughtful questions about the organizations that had donated. Not performing interest, actually interested. We ended up talking for 3 hours. I learned that Eli had grown up on a family farm in Hardin Valley, that his family had been in that valley for 4 generations, that he'd gone away to college, gotten a degree in agricultural economics, come back, and spent the better part of a decade quietly building something that I didn't fully understand the scale of at the time. He mentioned once, almost in passing, that he'd done some work with the state legislature on rural development initiatives. I nodded politely. I didn't ask too many questions because I didn't want to seem like I was doing a background check on a man I'd just met, and honestly, at that point, I was too busy noticing that he had the best laugh I'd ever heard in my life. We exchanged numbers, we had coffee the next week, then dinner, then more dinners, then hikes and farmers markets and long drives out to the valley where he'd show me what his family had built. And what they had built was extraordinary. Hundreds of acres of working farmland, a regenerative agriculture operation that had won state and national recognition, a foundation that funded rural education programs across 6 counties, a family legacy that ran so deep into the Tennessee soil that it was practically geological. I fell in love with all of it. I fell in love with him. But here's the thing about Eli Caldwell that is essential to understanding everything that comes later. He was the most genuinely, almost aggressively humble person I had ever met. He didn't talk about his family's influence. He didn't name drop. He drove a 12-year-old pickup truck with a cracked dashboard and paid for our early dates with a debit card that was visibly worn at the edges. He introduced himself to everyone, the same way. Just Eli. No title, no preamble, just Eli. So when I brought him home to meet my parents for the first time, about 8 months into our relationship, he showed up exactly as he always was. Jeans, a clean flannel shirt, the worn debit card, the easy laugh. And my mother took one look at him and decided he wasn't good enough for her daughter. Which is, I realize, a sentence that requires some processing given everything. My daughter, the art school dropout, the nonprofit worker, the serial dater of woodworkers, wasn't good enough for my mother's standards, and the man I'd brought home, who was quietly one of the most accomplished people in the state of Tennessee, wasn't good enough either, because he showed up in flannel. That was the beginning of the end of a certain chapter of my life. Eli proposed on the farm. Of course he did. It was a Sunday evening in late September, and we were walking the back ridge of the property, the part that looks out over the valley, the part where on a clear day you can see 3 counties. And he stopped and turned to me and said, without preamble, without a speech, just, "I want to spend my life with you. Will you marry me?" The ring had belonged to his grandmother. It was simple and old and perfect. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We drove back to the farmhouse and called our families. Eli's parents, Thomas and Grace Caldwell, 2 of the warmest, most quietly dignified people I have ever met, were so genuinely happy they could barely speak. His mother cried, his father laughed and said, "Well, it's about time," which made Eli turn red, which I loved. My parents' reaction was different. My mother said, "Oh." Then she asked where he was from again. Then she asked what his family did. Eli had told her at that first meeting that his family had a farm in Hardin Valley and that he worked in agricultural development. She had filed that information somewhere in the category of not impressive, and apparently it had stayed there. I said, "Mom, I'm engaged." She said, "I heard you, Savannah. I'm just trying to understand the situation." The situation. Over the following weeks, the questions came. What was his family's income? Did they have insurance? Was he going to be able to support me? Was I sure I didn't want to wait and see if something better came along? This last one was delivered with enough plausible deniability that I almost couldn't call it what it was, but I've known my mother 30 years and I know exactly what she meant. I told Eli about the conversations because I don't keep things from him and because he deserved to know what he was getting into. He listened without getting defensive or angry. He said, "People make assumptions. It doesn't change anything between us." Then he squeezed my hand and changed the subject to what kind of flowers I wanted at the wedding. That, right there, is Eli Caldwell. When it came to planning the wedding, we were aligned from the beginning. We wanted it small, intimate, meaningful, on the farm where Eli's grandparents had been married, where his parents had renewed their vows, where the land itself held the memory of the people who had loved each other in that place. We wanted our people there, our real people, our friends, our chosen family, the community members who had been part of our lives. We were looking at maybe 120 guests. When I told my mother the plan, the barn, the farm, the wildflowers, the outdoor reception, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "A barn wedding." "A beautiful barn," I said. "Eli's family spent 2 months restoring it. It's going to be stunning." "Savannah," her voice had that particular flatness to it, "you understand what a barn wedding says about a person. It says I'm marrying the man I love on his family's land, surrounded by the people we care about. It says you couldn't do better." I went quiet. "Your sister had her wedding at the Tennessean, 400 guests, covered in the society pages. That is what a wedding should look like." "I'm not Courtney." "No," she agreed, "you certainly aren't." And that was the conversation that set the tone for everything that followed. Over the next 3 months, my mother campaigned, there's no other word for it, against our wedding. She sent me venue brochures, hotel ballrooms, country club packages. Once, memorably, a printed-out listing for a wedding venue in Gatlinburg that had a waterfall feature and, according to the brochure, could accommodate up to 700 of your closest friends and family. I did not have 700 friends and family. I had never had 700 friends and family. She called Eli's mother twice, without telling me. I found out later from Grace, who handled both calls with considerably more grace than they deserved. My mother had apparently suggested that a more appropriate venue might be worth exploring, and had implied that the barn setting reflected a lack of ambition on Eli's part. Grace had listened politely, offered nothing, and mentioned it to Eli, who mentioned it to me. That was when I told my mother that if she called the Caldwells again without my knowledge, she would not be receiving a wedding invitation at all. She accused me of being dramatic. I said nothing. I held the line. 3 weeks before the wedding, she escalated. My parents called me, both of them, on speaker, which is always a sign that my father has been recruited as backup, and told me that they had discussed it and they had decided they would not be attending. I remember the exact moment. I was sitting in our apartment, cross-legged on the couch, and Eli was in the kitchen making dinner, and I could hear him moving around, the quiet sounds of him, and I held the phone and let my mother's words settle. "We don't do barn weddings with peasants," she said. And I want to be very clear, that is a direct quote. Those are the exact words she used. Peasants. She called the people on our guest list farmers, teachers, community organizers, local officials, childhood friends, neighbors who had known Eli's family for generations, peasants. I asked her, very quietly, if she wanted to reconsider that word. She did not. My father said nothing. He never said anything when it mattered. "If you go through with this," my mother said, "you're making a statement about who you are and what you value, and you'll have to live with the embarrassment." "The only embarrassment I see right now," I said, "is this conversation." I hung up. I sat there for about 30 seconds, and then Eli leaned around the kitchen doorway and said, "You okay?" I said, "They're not coming." He crossed the room and sat next to me and took my hand. "Okay," he said. Not, "I'm sorry," not, should we try to fix this? Just, okay, accepting it, moving through it. That is the man I married. I want to pause here and tell you about the guest list, because here's the thing my mother didn't know, the thing none of us had really talked about publicly, because that's not how Eli operates, was who was going to be at that wedding. Yes, there were farmers. Yes, there were teachers. Yes, there were community organizers and neighbors, and the man who had been Eli's Little League coach, and the woman who had taught his mother to make biscuits. There were also 3 state senators, 2 county executives, the director of the Tennessee Department of Agriculture, a federal appellate judge who had known Eli's grandfather, a nationally recognized conservationist who had worked with the Caldwell Foundation for a decade, and, as it happened, the governor of Tennessee, who was not just a professional contact of Eli's, but had been his college roommate and one of his oldest friends. I had known all of this. It had never occurred to me to tell my mother, partly because I knew it would change her calculus, and I was done with people who showed up for the wrong reasons. If she wasn't coming because she loved me, I didn't want her there because she was impressed. So I said nothing. I let her call it a barn wedding with peasants. And then I got married. October in Hardin Valley is something I cannot fully do justice to in words. The colors on the ridge that weekend were extraordinary. Amber and gold and a red so deep it looked like the hills were lit from within. The air was cool and sharp and smelled like apples and wood smoke. The old barn, which the Caldwell family had spent months restoring, glowed from inside with hundreds of warm string lights, its weathered wood luminous against the evening sky. I got ready in the farmhouse, in the room that had been Grace Caldwell's when she was a girl, surrounded by the women who loved me unconditionally through every chapter of my life. My best friend Nora, who had flown in from Portland, my college roommate Deja, Eli's cousin Lily, who I had claimed as my own within a week of meeting her, his Aunt Ruth, who pressed a small packet of rosemary in my hand at the door and said, "For remembrance, baby girl," and made me cry the first and only time that day. My father of the bride role was filled, with my full blessing and enormous joy, by my Uncle David, my mother's younger brother, who had always been the rebel of the family, the one who'd shown up to Easter in a motorcycle jacket and taught me how to argue and never once told me I needed to do better. He cried the entire walk down the aisle. He is my favorite person in my family of origin, and I will say that without apology. The ceremony was in the meadow, as the sun started to come down behind the ridge. Eli stood at the end of the aisle in a dark suit that fit him like it had been made for him, because it had, by a tailor in Knoxville, who was the son of a man his grandfather had known. And when he came around the edge of the tree line and he saw me, his face did something that I will carry with me until I die. He looked at me like I was the most important thing he had ever seen. Not the most beautiful, not the most impressive, the most important. Like everything before that moment had been orientation, and I was the destination. We wrote our own vows. I am not going to share them here because they belong to us, and we meant them every word in a way I'd rather hold privately. But I will say that Eli made me laugh twice, and made me cry once, and that the 120 people in that meadow were so quiet during those vows that I could hear the creek running on the other side of the fence line. Governor James Whitmore, Jim to Eli, who had been mispronouncing his last name on purpose since 1999, as a bit that had apparently never gotten old, sat in the third row and cried like a baby. I know because Deja texted me a photo afterward. The reception was everything. Long tables in the barn, wildflowers in mason jars, food from 3 local farms, a bluegrass band that played until 11, and dancing that started formal and ended with the federal appellate judge doing the electric slide at approximately 10:15, which is an image I will treasure forever. Nobody performed status. Nobody competed. Nobody looked around trying to figure out if the right people were there, because the right people were there, in every meaningful sense of the word. My mother was not there, and in her absence there was only relief. Late that night, Eli and I stood on the barn's upper loft looking down at the last of our guests dancing and laughing, and he put his arm around me and said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Like myself. Like completely, entirely myself." "Good," he said. "That's the whole point." He kissed my temple, and we stood there until the last song ended.
We stayed that night in a cabin on the back of the property and drove to the Blue Ridge the next morning for a week in a place with no Wi-Fi, no agenda, and a wood-burning stove that I used approximately 6 times a day out of pure joy. But before we left the valley, while Eli was loading the car, I checked my phone. The late local news and then the morning news had covered the reception. I didn't know it was going to happen. Neither did Eli. But apparently, when the governor of Tennessee attends a private event, it generates coverage. And when that coverage happens to include footage of him dancing at a barn wedding in Hardin Valley, surrounded by senators and laughing harder than anyone had seen him laugh in months, it tends to circulate. The segment was warm and genuine. It was framed around the Caldwell family's legacy, the farm, the foundation's work in rural education. There was a brief interview with Governor Whitmore, Jim, who said, "Eli Caldwell is one of the finest people I have ever known, and today was one of the best days I've had in years." They showed footage from the reception, the long tables, the string lights, the bluegrass band, the barn, and I thought, oh. Then I looked at my missed calls. 62, all from my mother. Starting at 6:47 a.m., which meant she had either been up very early or had not slept at all. And either way, she had watched that news coverage, and the ground had shifted under her feet in a way she had not anticipated. I sat on the porch of that cabin with my coffee, and I looked at those 62 calls, and I made a decision. I was not going to call her back. Not out of cruelty, not to punish her, but because I had learned over 30 years of being Diane Mercer's daughter that the conversations that followed moments like this always went the same way. She would not apologize, not genuinely. She would explain. She would reframe. She would find a way to make her behavior logical and my feelings an overreaction. And then, slowly, over time, she would expect me to pretend none of it had happened. I was done pretending. But there was one more thing I needed to do. Now, I need to tell you something about my mother's professional life. She had worked for 20 years at a commercial real estate firm in Knoxville, starting as an administrative coordinator and working her way up to office manager through a combination of genuine competence and ferocious politicking. She was good at her job. She ran a tight ship. And for those 20 years, her professional world and her personal world had been entirely separate, which suited her perfectly because it meant the social performances she ran at home never intersected with the professional ones she ran at the office. Her boss, the firm's managing partner, a man named Harrison Cole, was a client of the Caldwell Foundation. He had been for years. He knew Eli. He knew Eli's family. He had, as it turned out, been at the wedding. He had been at the third table to the right, next to the federal appellate judge, and had apparently also participated in the electric slide, though with limited but enthusiastic technique. Harrison Cole had sent Eli a congratulatory message that morning, and in that message he had mentioned, warmly, without any apparent awareness of the irony, that he was so glad to know that Eli and that wonderful young woman were going to be so happy together, and that he'd see Eli at the Foundation's board meeting the following month. Eli showed me the message. I looked at it for a long time. Then I called Harrison Cole. I want to be precise about what I did and why, because I don't want it misunderstood. I did not call Harrison Cole to get my mother fired. I did not call him to damage her professionally or to blow up her career. That was never the goal. I called him because he was a decent man who had been at my wedding, who clearly had no idea that his office manager had spent months characterizing that wedding, and by extension, the Caldwells and everyone who attended, as trashy and beneath consideration. And I called him because I was done carrying the weight of my mother's secrets for her. Harrison picked up on the second ring. He was warm and congratulatory, and told me twice that the ceremony was beautiful. I thanked him,
And then I told him briefly and factually that my mother had declined to attend the wedding, that she had described it as a barn wedding with peasants, and that she had made a number of comments over the preceding months that were, shall we say, inconsistent with the reality of the situation. There was a pause. Harrison said, "She called it what?" I repeated it. Another pause, longer. "Savannah," he said slowly, "you understand that I have been a board member of the Caldwell Foundation for 9 years. Your husband and I have worked together on 3 major rural education initiatives. I attended his parents' 25th anniversary celebration." "I know," I said. "Your mother has worked for me for 20 years." "I know," I said. He was quiet for another moment. Then, "Thank you for telling me. And congratulations again, truly." We said our goodbyes. He called my mother 20 minutes later. I know this because she called me 40 minutes after that, call number 78 by that point, and when I let it go to voicemail, the message she left was not the performance of hurt feelings I had expected. It was something rawer and more real than that. She was scared. For the first time in as long as I can remember, I could hear it clearly. My mother was genuinely, deeply scared. She didn't lose her job, I want to be clear about that. Harrison Cole is a fair man and a smart one, and he knew better to make a personnel decision on emotion. But I know from what came later that the conversation with him recalibrated something. That 20 years of carefully curated professional persona had suddenly been complicated by the knowledge that the woman who ran his office had looked at his friend's son's wedding and called it trash. That the network my mother never knew she was embedded in, through her daughter, through her daughter's husband, through all those peasants in the barn, was wider and more consequential than she had imagined. The ground had shifted, and I had moved on.
I didn't speak to my mother for 4 months after the wedding. She tried. She called, she texted, she sent a card at Christmas that was trying very hard to be an apology without actually being one. My father emailed once, awkwardly, saying he hoped things were smoothing out, which was so classically Robert Mercer that I almost felt fond. When I finally agreed to a conversation in February, it was on my terms. A Sunday afternoon phone call, 60 minutes. I told her at the start, I was not interested in explanations, I was not interested in revisionist history, I was interested in whether she was capable of acknowledging, simply and honestly, what she had done and what it had cost. It took her most of the hour to get there. She circled it and deflected and began 3 different sentences that were moving in the right direction before veering away. But in the final minutes, she said something I had never heard from her before. She said, "I think I have been afraid my whole life that I wasn't enough, and I took that fear and I put it on you." It wasn't everything. It wasn't sufficient, but it was real. It was the first real thing she had said to me in longer than I could remember. I said, "I know. I've known for a long time." We are not close. We may never be close in the way I once might have wanted. But we are honest now, in a way we never were, and that is more valuable to me than any performance of closeness we could have manufactured. Eli and I celebrated our first anniversary last October, back on the farm, just the 2 of us and a bottle of the local apple wine that had been on our wedding tables. We walked the back ridge as the sun went down and the valley went gold, and he reached over and took my hand the same way he always does. Easy, certain, like it's the most natural thing in the world. "Good year?" he asked. "Best year," I said, and I meant it. Here is what I know now that I wish I had known younger. The people who tried to diminish your choices, your joy, your love, the ones who call your beautiful things trashy, who measure worth by the wrong instruments, who only show up when the guest list is impressive enough, those people are not arbiters of your value. They are people who have never learned to locate worth anywhere other than in the opinions of others, and they will spend their lives being wrong about what matters. Your barn is not lesser than their ballroom. Your 120 people are not lesser than their 400.
The wildflowers and the mason jars, the bluegrass band, the judge doing the electric slide, these things are not consolation prizes. They are the whole point. I am Savannah Caldwell. I was married on a farm in Hardin Valley on an October evening when the hills were on fire with color, surrounded by every person who had truly seen me. My mother called it trashy. The governor of Tennessee called it one of the best days he'd had in years. I know which one I believe, and I didn't need 62 missed calls to figure that out.